The fluorescent lights of Meridian Tower hummed their usual midnight song as Marcus Webb dragged his mop bucket across the marble floors of the 42nd floor. The building was nearly empty at this hour, save for the cleaning crew and the occasional security guard making rounds. Marcus liked it this way, the quiet, the stillness, the way the city lights sparkled through the floor-to-ceiling windows like 1,000 fallen stars. It was in these silent hours that he could think clearly, could breathe without the weight of the world pressing too hard against his chest. He would think about Sophie, his 7-year-old daughter, sleeping peacefully in her small bedroom at his mother's apartment across town, her stuffed rabbit tucked under her arm, her dreams hopefully filled with nothing more complicated than rainbows and cartoon characters. He worked nights so he could walk her to school in the mornings, pack her lunch with the crusts cut off the way she liked, and be there when she scraped her knees on the playground. He had been doing this for 3 years, ever since his wife Elena had passed from a sudden cardiac event that had taken her at 31 years old and left Marcus standing at the edge of a life he no longer recognized, holding the hand of a 4-year-old girl who kept asking when mommy was coming home. The janitorial job at Meridian Financial Group didn't pay much, but it paid enough, and the benefits covered Sophie's asthma medication, and that was what mattered. Marcus had a degree in mathematics from State University, had even started a graduate program in applied statistics before Elena got sick and the bills started multiplying faster than solutions, but none of that felt relevant anymore. What mattered was the mop, the bucket, the quiet marble floors, and getting home before Sophie woke up. It was on an ordinary Tuesday night in March that everything changed, though Marcus would not fully understand the magnitude of that change until many hours later, when the sun had risen and the world had shifted in ways he could not have predicted even with all his mathematical precision. He was working his way down the corridor toward the executive conference suite, a glass-walled room that the cleaning staff called the fishbowl, when he noticed the lights were still on inside. This was unusual. The executive floor typically cleared out by 9, and it was now midnight. Marcus paused, leaning on his mop handle, peering through the glass at the scene unfolding inside. 4 men and 2 women in expensive suits sat around the long mahogany table, their faces pale and tight with the particular tension that Marcus had come to associate with very bad news. A massive presentation screen dominated one wall, covered in charts and figures that cascaded in red, deep, alarming crimson that even from the corridor looked like financial hemorrhage. Coffee cups and takeout containers littered the table. Someone had loosened their tie. Someone else was holding their head in their hands. Marcus would have moved on, it wasn't his business, and he had floors to finish before 4 in the morning, but something caught his eye. The spreadsheet on the screen. The numbers. His mind, trained by years of graduate-level mathematics and sharpened further by 3 years of doing mental calculations just to keep himself sane during the long silent hours of cleaning empty offices, registered something almost involuntarily. Like a musician hearing a wrong note in a symphony. Like a poet hearing a broken meter in a poem. There was something wrong with the numbers on that screen. Something that didn't add up, not in a minor way, not in a rounding error way, but in a fundamental, structural, catastrophic way. He stood there for a moment longer than he should have, his mop forgotten, his eyes moving across the columns and rows of data that he could see reflected in the glass, and then he knocked. The knock was soft, almost apologetic, the way Marcus did everything, quietly, without demanding attention. But in the silence of midnight, it was loud enough. One of the women, a sharp-featured executive in her 50s whom Marcus recognized as someone whose office he cleaned on Thursdays, looked up. Her name placard said Catherine Voss, Chief Financial Officer. She frowned at him, the way people sometimes frowned at him when he appeared with his card at inconvenient moments, not unkind exactly, just occupied, just caught in a world where his presence was background noise. She shook her head slightly, a gesture that meant not now, we're busy. Marcus nodded and began to turn away. Then he stopped. He thought about Sophie. He thought about Elena. He thought about all the moments in life when he had stayed quiet when he should have spoken, when he had stepped back when he should have stepped forward, and how much those silences had cost him over the years. He turned back and knocked again, a little firmer. Catherine Voss opened the glass door herself, her expression carefully controlled but her eyes carrying the particular exhaustion of someone who had been fighting a losing battle for hours. "We're in the middle of a critical session," she said, her voice professionally cool. "Can it wait?" Marcus looked past her at the screen, at the cascading red numbers, and said the 5 words that would change the trajectory of that night and several lives along with it. "There's an error in column 7. The room went still. Not the polite, dismissive stillness of people waiting for an interruption to end, but the sharp, electric stillness of people who have just heard something that cuts through the noise. Catherine Voss turned slowly to look at him more fully. "I'm sorry," she said. "Column 7, Marcus said quietly, gesturing toward the screen with a slight nod of his head. "The compounding interval is applied twice. It doubles the liability projection. The actual exposure is roughly half of what you're seeing." There was a silence that lasted perhaps 3 full seconds, which in that room, at that moment, felt like 3 years. The man at the head of the table stood up. Marcus recognized him too, not from cleaning his office, because his office was on the 44th floor and Marcus's crew didn't go that high, but from the portrait in the lobby, from the annual report that had been left in the recycling bin outside the mailroom last quarter. Richard Calloway, Chief Executive Officer of Meridian Financial Group, 62 years old, silver-haired, the kind of man who appeared in the financial press with the casual regularity of a weather pattern. He was looking at Marcus the way people sometimes looked at optical illusions, with the uncertain expression of someone whose eyes were telling them something their brain was not yet prepared to accept. "Come in," he said. "Just that. Come in." Marcus left his mop cart in the corridor and entered the conference room for the first time in 3 years of working in that building. The room smelled of coffee and stress and expensive cologne. He approached the screen, and someone, he wasn't sure who, handed him a laser pointer, which he held awkwardly for a moment before setting it down and simply walking closer to the display. He pointed with his finger, the way Sophie pointed at things she was learning to name. "Here," he said. "Your model is compounding quarterly in the base calculation, and then the summary function is compounding again annually on top of that. If your exposure is actually being calculated this way, you've been presenting a liability figure that is approximately 1.8 times the real number." He paused. Give or take rounding. The silence in the room had a different quality now. It was not the silence of dismissal. It was the silence of people rapidly recalculating, of experienced financial minds running the scenario through their own understanding, of dominoes tipping in slow motion. Catherine Voss had moved to the laptop and was typing rapidly, pulling up the underlying formula structure. She stopped typing. She stared at the screen. She said, very quietly, a single word that was not suitable for print. What followed was not a dramatic Hollywood moment of instant celebration. It was instead a focused, intense 45 minutes of verification, of pulling source data, of running the corrected formula, of cross-referencing against 3 other documents that had been built on the same flawed model. Marcus sat in one of the chairs along the wall, out of the way, his hands folded in his lap, watching. Nobody told him to leave. Nobody looked at him the way they had when he first knocked on the glass. Richard Calloway kept glancing over at him with an expression Marcus couldn't quite read, something between scrutiny and calculation and something softer underneath, though Marcus didn't trust his ability to read the expressions of powerful men. He was better with numbers. At the end of those 45 minutes, Catherine Voss turned from the laptop and said, to the room in general and to no one in particular, "He's right. The corrected exposure is 47.3 million. We've been modeling it at 88 million. She paused. We were 3 hours from presenting the inflated figure to the emergency board session. The room absorbed this. Richard Calloway absorbed it. He turned to look at Marcus directly, with the full weight of his attention, and Marcus had the sudden sensation of being seen, not as background, not as furniture, not as the man who emptied the wastebaskets and wiped down the whiteboards, but as a person, specific and whole, sitting in a chair in a room where he had never sat before. "What's your name?" Richard Calloway asked. Marcus Webb, Marcus said. How do you know that formula structure? Marcus considered the question. It deserved a real answer. I have a degree in applied mathematics, he said. I almost finished a graduate program in statistical modeling. My wife got sick. Things changed. He said it without self-pity, just as fact, the way he had learned to carry the story of his life, lightly, efficiently, without excess weight. Richard Calloway nodded slowly. Then he pulled out the chair directly across from Marcus and sat down in it, which struck Marcus as an odd thing for the CEO of a $100 billion financial group to do at 1 in the morning with his executive team watching, but Richard Calloway seemed like a man who had stopped caring about what was odd some years back. Tell me about yourself, he said. Not in the casual, dismissive way people sometimes said it as a social formula, but in the way of a man who genuinely intended to listen to the answer. And so Marcus told him. He told him about State University, about the graduate program, about Elena and the diagnosis and the bills and the decision to leave school and take whatever work would keep Sophie fed and medicated and loved. He told him about the night shifts and the morning school runs and Sophie's stuffed rabbit and the way she was already showing a talent for arithmetic that made Marcus's heart ache with a pride so sharp it was almost painful. He told him about the quiet of empty offices at midnight and how he had never stopped doing math in his head because it was the only thing that made the long hours feel connected to something he had once been. Richard Calloway listened to all of it. He did not interrupt. He did not check his phone. When Marcus finished, the CEO was quiet for a moment, and then he looked around at his executive team, who were watching this conversation with the particular attention of people witnessing something they understood was significant without yet knowing exactly why. Then Richard Calloway said something that left the room completely speechless, and which Catherine Voss would later say she had replayed in her memory many times in the months that followed. He said, "I want you to come work for us. Properly. With a title and a salary and an office on the 44th floor." There was no dramatic pause for effect. He said it the way he apparently said all things, directly, without theater. I run a financial institution that nearly walked into an $88 million misrepresentation tonight because not one of the 6 people in this room caught an error that you identified in 30 seconds through a glass wall. That tells me something about what you can do that I would be foolish to ignore. Marcus stared at him. He had not expected this. He was not a man who expected things from the universe, having learned through experience that the universe distributed its surprises without much regard for desert or merit. "I'm a janitor," he said, not with shame, just with the precision of a man who liked to name things accurately. Richard Calloway nodded. "I know what you are right now," he said. "I'm asking what you'd like to be." Marcus went home that morning as the sun was coming up over the city, rode the bus the way he always did, let himself into his mother's apartment quietly so as not to wake Sophie. He sat at the kitchen table for a long time with a cup of instant coffee and the particular stillness of a man who has just had his life turned over like a card in a game he didn't know he was playing. He thought about Elena, about what she would say if she could see this moment, and he thought she would probably laugh, that bright, surprised laugh she had, the one that always sounded like she was delighted by the world's capacity to be strange and good. He thought about Sophie and the asthma medication and the stuffed rabbit and the long nights and the morning school runs and the quiet marble floors of the 42nd floor. He thought about column 7 and the compounding interval and the way his mind had registered the error before he had consciously decided to look for it. He thought about Richard Calloway sitting across from him in that conference room chair, asking what he would like to be. And Marcus Webb, 41 years old, widower, single father, janitor, mathematician, sat at his mother's kitchen table as the city woke up around him, and for the first time in 3 years, he allowed himself the extraordinary luxury of imagining a different answer to that question. He took the position. It was not instant. There were interviews, formal ones, with Catherine Voss and the head of quantitative risk and 2 other people whose titles Marcus didn't fully catch, but they were interviews that felt less like tests and more like conversations, because Richard Calloway had apparently made clear that the outcome was largely a formality and that the real evaluation had already happened through a glass wall at midnight with a mop cart in the corridor. Marcus started on the fourth Monday of April as a senior analyst in the risk modeling division, which was a title that sounded imposing but which Marcus privately felt was simply an official name for what he had been doing informally in his head for 3 years while mopping floors. He wore the one good suit he owned to his first day and bought a second one on the Friday of that week with his first partial paycheck. He arranged for Sophie to go to after-school care, which she loved because there was a girl named Destiny there who also liked arithmetic and who became Sophie's best friend within the first week. He moved out of his mother's apartment into a small 2-bedroom in a quieter neighborhood with a park nearby where Sophie could run without traffic worry. He was good at the job, which surprised no one who had been in the conference room that night and surprised Marcus least of all. Numbers were his native language, the one he had always thought in even when life had forced him to speak in different vocabularies, in mops and cleaning schedules and school-run logistics. He brought to the work not just technical skill but a quality his colleagues struggled to name precisely, a kind of patient attention, an unhurried thoroughness that came from 3 years of working alone in the quiet dark, answerable only to himself and the quality of what he left behind. He found errors the way other people found misplaced keys, naturally, without drama, just by being the kind of person who noticed things. Within 6 months he had restructured the liability modeling framework that had caused the crisis on that March midnight and reduced the division's error rate by a margin that Catherine Voss mentioned at 2 consecutive board meetings. Within a year he was leading a team of 7 analysts. Within 2 years he was presenting directly to the board himself, standing at the head of the same mahogany table where he had once watched through glass as a night shift worker who was not supposed to be part of the story. Richard Calloway made a habit of having lunch with Marcus once a month. They had a running conversation that ranged across mathematics, city politics, the philosophy of risk, and the particular challenges of raising daughters, because it turned out that Richard Calloway also had a daughter, now grown, and he spoke about her with a fondness that softened the sharp executive edges of the man in ways that his colleagues rarely saw. Marcus valued these lunches not for the career advantage they represented, though he was honest enough with himself to acknowledge that they represented plenty, but because Richard Calloway was a man who listened the way Marcus had always wanted people to listen, with his full attention, without performance, without the constant background calculation of what your words meant for him. He had been that way since the first night, since he had pulled up a chair at 1 in the morning and said "Tell me about yourself" and actually meant it. In a life where Marcus had often felt like background furniture, this felt like its own kind of grace. Sophie turned 10 the year her father was promoted to director of quantitative risk. They celebrated at a restaurant nicer than any they had been to before, and Sophie wore a dress with yellow flowers and ordered the pasta and asked the waiter 17 questions about the menu, which was the sort of child she was, curious, precise, unafraid to take up space with her questions. She did not fully understand what her father did for work, but she understood that it involved numbers and that numbers were important and that her father was good at them, and this seemed to her entirely logical because her father was good at everything that mattered. She still slept with the stuffed rabbit, though she had recently named it Professor Carrots, which Marcus thought showed excellent judgment. He watched her across the table in the restaurant, this small serious girl with Elena's eyes and his stubbornness, and felt the weight of everything that had happened and everything that hadn't happened, and was grateful for both with the complicated gratitude of a man who has learned to hold joy and grief in the same hand without letting go of either. Marcus never forgot the 42nd floor. He visited it sometimes, not often, not in a way that anyone would call sentimental, just occasionally when the building felt quiet in the evenings and he found himself on that floor for one reason or another. He would stand at the windows where he had once stood with a mop, looking out at the city lights that still sparkled like fallen stars, and he would think about the night that a wrong number on a screen and a habit of noticing things had rearranged the geography of his life. He had never been a man who believed in destiny. Mathematics inclined him toward probability, toward distributions and ranges rather than fixed outcomes, but he believed in moments, in the specific gravity of certain seconds when a choice to speak or stay silent shapes everything that follows. He had knocked on a glass wall at midnight. That was all. He had simply refused.